Hi, I'm Mark Madison, and welcome to the National Conservation Training Center series we call Conservationists in Action. So we have authors, scientists, writers come out and talk to us a little about their work or their recent publications. And we're very fortunate today in that we have an ornithologist and a very well-published author, Scott Weidensaul, joining us today. So welcome, Scott. It's
a pleasure
to have you out here.
Pleasure to be here.
And let me just give you a brief bio of Scott, and then we'll go into a little discussion about previous works in his most recent book. And Scott Weidensaul, as I mentioned, is incredibly prolific. He's written more than 24 books on natural history, including Living on the Wind, Across the Hemisphere with Migratory Birds, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He also wrote a book called The Ghost with Trembling Wings, about the search for species that may or may not be extinct, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. He's written Of a Feather, A Brief History of Birding, and his most recent book is a fascinating book. I just finished reading this weekend. It's called The First Frontier, The Forgotten History of Struggle, Savagery, and Endurance in Early America. He lectures wildly on wildlife and widely. well,
sometimes
that's to be determined.
Wildly.
Yeah, he lectures widely on wildlife topics, environmental topics, and I guess with the new book on environmental history to a certain extent, and
right.
Cultural history. Scott's been out here a number of times previously. He very kindly comes down periodically from Pennsylvania and enlightens us about his it must be almost annual new book.
Well,
you've written that many.
Not quite actually. I've been the one that just came out, The First Frontier, has been in the works for about 6 years. So
wow.
it's been a while. But it's always a pleasure to come down to NCTC.
I tell people history is hard to write, but they don't
it
always believe me.
Is.
And we do have two special guests also. In between Scott and I are the two eaglets out here at NCTC. We have a little eagle cam up on a large sycamore tree in the middle of our campus. And these eaglets are 7 weeks old. They were born in March of this year, and they are thriving and happy. And we may talk about eagles in a bit using Scott's expertise. But Scott, we're about a week away, or probably less than that, from International Migratory Bird Day, and it's celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And one of your most popular books, Living on the Wind, actually looked at migratory birds. And why do you find migratory birds of such personal interest?
I think anybody with a pulse finds bird migration at least intriguing, and it's kind of like a gateway drug for environmental consciousness and nature appreciation, because it's something that anybody can feel a sense of wonder and awe about. And the great thing about International Migratory Bird Day is it gives us a framework where we can reach out to the community through festivals, through events, through bird walks, and basically grab people who've never looked beyond the end of their nose and point up in the top of the tree and say, that little tiny thing up there that weighs less than half an ounce and is barely 5 inches long has flown here from the Orinoco Basin and is on its way to western British Columbia or Labrador, Newfoundland, or someplace. And you can start to spin these stories about these tiny little creatures that do these absolutely astonishing things about which we're still learning. I mean, it seems like almost every year there's some other new staggering discovery that we make about bird migration. For example, when I wrote my book on migration in 1999, I was able to say with some authority that the world champion migratory bird in terms of distance was the Arctic tern, which, by connecting the breeding grounds in the north and the wintering grounds in the south, we could make a back-of-the-envelope guesstimate that it was 22,000 to 25,000 miles a year. People would go, wow, that's absolutely amazing. Then we found out that shearwaters from Tasmania were flying 40,000 miles a year back and forth across the Pacific Ocean. And now, thanks to new tracking technology like light-sensitive geolocators, scientists like Ian Stenhouse and his colleagues have found out that Arctic terns from Greenland and Iceland, when you actually track their route, are not flying 22,000 or 25,000 miles a year. They're flying up to 47,000 miles a year. And we haven't even looked at what Arctic terns are doing in the Pacific, which is a much bigger ocean and potentially a much longer migration. And so that's actually something that I and a couple of other colleagues are going to be looking at next year, hopefully up in Alaska. So.
How do you research migratory birds today? And we've got a lot of displays here of people banding birds or flyway pilots and so on, but bring us up to date on the modern way of determining migratory bird pathways.
Well, I mean, and of course, the oldest technique is still probably the most widely used, which is bird banding. Putting a numbered ring on a bird's leg gives us, that unlocks so much information. And frankly, there's this huge database sitting at the Federal Bird Banding Lab in Laurel, Maryland, that scientists like Pete Mara at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center are just starting to mine for more information. And combining those data with new techniques like, and just, for example, a piece that Pete and his colleagues published recently where they combined banding data for gray catbirds with stable isotope analysis, where they're looking at the isotopes of chemicals like hydrogen and deuterium in the feathers of birds, and depending on whether the feather was grown in the wintering grounds or in the breeding grounds, you can determine where that bird came from, where it spent the winter. And they discovered that gray catbird populations are not this sort of monolithic block in the north and a monolithic block in the wintering range, but those from the mid-Atlantic region are primarily wintering in Florida and the Eastern Caribbean, and those from the Midwest are wintering in southern Mexico. And there's this whole notion of migratory connectivity where you can start to draw precise dots between certain breeding areas and certain wintering areas. From a conservation perspective, that's hugely important. And so, new tracking technologies, I mentioned light-sensitive geolocators, which have their drawbacks, and I say that from bitter experience because I had a big project working with them with northern saw-whet owls that kind of flopped, but when they work well, they give you the ability to track over the course of many migration seasons birds that are much too small to put satellite transmitters or more bulky transmitters on. If you're working with a bigger bird like bald eagles, golden eagles, many of the shorebirds, you can put GPS-based satellite transmitters on, or transmitters that work off what are known as GSM transmitters that work off cell phone networks. So as long as they're within range of a cell phone tower, they can triangulate their position with incredible precision. And all
lose a lot of those in West Virginia.
Yeah.
We have a lot of dead zones here.
Yep. Well, and yet we're using scientists like Todd Katzner and Mike Lanzone and some of the other folks working with eastern golden eagle populations that migrate down through West Virginia and Pennsylvania are using GSM transmitters.
That's great.
I mean, getting the level of detail where you can see these birds, in some cases actually see them where they were circling and thermaling on their migration. So giving us the level of detail that allows us to say, this is an incredibly important golden eagle migration route here. If we move this proposed wind farm just a quarter of a mile, it may avoid a lot of conflicts there.
That's great. And in fact, next week we're going to have the West Virginia State Ornithologist come out here. Richard Bailey, I think.
Okay.
And he's going to be talking about wind farms and a huge issue here.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, what's one of the more interesting things that struck you about migratory birds? One of the things when you write a book is you learn interesting facts that you can share.
Well, I mean, as a lifelong birder and sort of museum quality nature nerd, the birds obviously were the thing that really drew it to me. What surprised me was how much of the story was a story of people. People from so many different economic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, landowners in Argentina, campesinos in Mexico, a retired electrician in Alabama who's probably the world's expert on ruby-throated hummingbirds. I mean, all these people that are, have had their lives changed by contact with migratory birds, and who recognize the importance of preserving, this robust globe-encircling phenomenon, and they're just doing everything in their power to make sure that we preserve that for future generations. It's really it's such a people story as well as an animal story,
which resonates in all of your books, actually. But before we leave migratory birds, one last obvious question coming up on International Migratory Bird Day is what do you think the greatest threats are to migratory birds? There's many, obviously.
Well, there are, and I mean the two big ones are habitat degradation, and particularly as it affects stopover habitat, which is the one part of the puzzle that we were pretty late to the party to recognize. I mean, if you look at, for example, the National Wildlife Refuge System, that was founded primarily on preserving major breeding areas, and for waterfowl, especially major wintering areas. And especially in the 80s, we focused a lot of attention on neotropical migrants and the fate of tropical wintering habitat, non-breeding habitat. And it's really only been fairly recently, maybe in the last 15 years, that we've really begun to focus a lot of attention on the importance of stopover habitat, and especially the importance of this kind of diffuse stopover habitat. You know, what's been categorized as convenience stores. I mean, there's five-star hotels, there's convenience stores, and then there's fire escapes. And fire escapes are those places where birds can pile out during a migration emergency as they're coming across the Gulf in the springtime. Five-star hotels are like these big bottomland swamp forests in the south with everything they need. But a convenience store can be somebody's backyard where the bird stops briefly. If you've got a couple of native berry producing plants in a corner of your backyard, if you've let things just get a little shaggy back there, if you're planting native species, I mean, you can create important stopover habitat. You multiply that by millions of backyards in America, and we could make a really significant difference for migratory birds.
That's a great message, and we do teach some courses on backyard habitat, but a lot of people will watch this when they come visit NCTC, and they might not even be full-time conservationists. If you had to recommend a couple things to have in your backyard that would help birds, do you have some recommendations off the cuff?
Well, as I said, native, high-quality, fruit-producing shrubs are. I mean, it's one of the best things. I mean, this is primarily for birds in their fall migration. But I mean, here in the east, any of the native dogwoods, almost any of the native viburnums, spice bush is a really good one. You don't want to pick something that's going to hold its berries all winter, because those are the plants that have berries with the nutritional value of library paste. You want something that the birds are going to eat 30 seconds after they become ripe. I mean, that's probably the biggest bang for the buck value you can have. And just don't be an obsessive gardener. Don't clean it up. Nature loves a mess. My wife and I have an acre in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. We have a couple hundred species of wildflowers and native shrubs and plants there. And at the end of the growing season, they just all sits there all through the winter, all those cone flowers and whatnot with their seed heads, feeding the birds. In the spring, when the first green stuff comes up, I go out and take it all down, clean it up for the year. But through the winter, it's providing habitat and it's providing food. I'm sure, you ask the local township road crew when they're out for directions to my house, they say, "Oh yeah, look for the place with all the weeds." But
and all the birds.
And all the birds.
Yeah, that's perfect. You mentioned just a minute ago, you're fascinated by the people involved in migratory bird research. We had you out a number of years ago to talk about another one of your books, The Ghost with Trembling Wings, that very much is a people-oriented story too. It was looking at species that either are extinct or may be extinct, and the passion that drives people.
That's right.
To look for these species. What drove you to write that book? That was a bit different than the previous ones.
Well, it was in part it was a lifelong fascination with the mystery of whether something is still out there. Is the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, still roaming the island of Tasmania? Are there mountain lions in the east? I mean, growing up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, good friend of mine who retired many years ago from the Pennsylvania Game Commission said, "Wow, mountain lions were my biggest success. We never spent a dime on them. They never ate a single deer, and people claim to have seen more than they saw of bald eagles." But what's the root of that? Or why do people think they see these animals in landscapes where they don't? And of course, there are many species that we've given up for extinct, sometimes for centuries, that almost like magic reappear. The Bermuda petrel was given up for extinct for 300 years before it was finally rediscovered. So every once in a while, in the midst of this huge extinction crisis that we're in, the sixth mass extinction, the planet gives us this completely unmerited gift of giving back something that we thought was gone. And so the other reason that I picked that, it was an optimistic, feel-good way to write about an otherwise really depressing subject, which is extinction. So
it's not a depressing book at all.
Well, I think
it's very interesting.
I'd like to think not, because I really did try to focus on, the sense that we want the world at some level to be bigger and more mysterious and more exciting and more complete than we might otherwise know that it is. And in fact, and so as you know, the book was a series of trips and expeditions that I did in North America, in the Caribbean, in South America, in Australia, in the UK, looking for species that are thought to be gone or shouldn't be in the landscape to start with. And one or two of those species that I was looking for, even though we didn't find them, somebody else has since then. So I mean, the cone-billed tanager in South America, which was, I spent a month with my friend Doug Wexler from the Academy of Natural Sciences looking for this bird that had only ever been seen once. One specimen collected in 1938 and then gone, assumed extinct. But, in this vast, relatively unexplored landscape. And so we were looking in an area about the size of the state of Texas for this bird. And about 3 years after we came up unsuccessful, it was found entirely by accident about 1,000 miles away in a different part of Brazil. And you can now take cone-billed tanager watching trips to South America to see this rediscovered bird.
Speaking of extinction, it might be time to come up with a new edition of Trembling Wings, because we're less than 2 years away from the anniversary of the passenger pigeon.
That's right.
There's already been a lot of talk within the Society for Conservation Biology and so on. What are we going to do to commemorate or remember at least the extinction of the passenger pigeon? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it's the perfect teachable moment. And in fact, there's, as you're probably aware, there's a whole consortium of organizations and institutions and individuals in the U.S. and Canada called the Passenger Pigeon Project that are working to turn 2014 into a teachable moment about extinction. And of course, shortly after that anniversary, with the anniversary of the loss of the Carolina parakeet, the only native parrot in most of North America. So, these are two really seminal events, and I think the lesson of the passenger pigeon, of course, there's a number of them. One is that you can never be complacent. My friend Nate Rice, who's the collections manager for birds at the Academy of Natural Sciences, was giving a couple of people a tour of the back scenes of the Academy a couple of years ago, and he pulled out a drawer in the collections, and it was full of, he must have had hundreds of American robins in there. And somebody said, geez, Nate, you got enough robins? And he said, I will take every robin I can get, because once upon a time there were 20 times more passenger pigeons than there were robins. Yeah. You never know what's going to happen. Look what's happened with white nose syndrome in bats. Yeah. Who could have predicted 5 years ago, that something would come in and wipe out 98% of the bats in the northeastern United States? So we can't be complacent. And the other lesson, I think, that is really important, and this is one that was articulated in the early 1930s and 40s by Rosalie Edge, who was one of the until recently forgotten heroines of American conservation. And Mrs. Edge said the time to save a species is when it's still common. Yeah. We should not wait until it's a crisis moment. And so, the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet are incredible examples of both of those, how we can go from incredible abundance to nothing in a very short time. And that, when you finally realize that you're on the brink, it's often too late. And if it's not, it's going to be a long and expensive process to bring those species back.
That's a beautiful quote by Rosalie Edge. That ought to be the motto of the wildlife refuge system. The time
Absolutely.
to save a species is when it's still common.
That's exactly right.
I love that. Now, Rosalie Edge actually worked to preserve Hawk Mountain.
Well, in fact, she's the reason. Yeah, in fact, she was the person
in your neighborhood, generally,
just up the ridge from me. In 1934, when local gunners were shooting literally thousands of hawks and eagles and falcons each year in their migration, she tried to get the National Audubon Society interested. But of course, in those days, even professional ornithologists, even professional conservationists tended to divide the bird world into good birds and bad birds. And the bad birds were the ones that ate the good birds. So nobody really cared that much that they were shooting all these hawks. And so she stepped in, and with a small group called the Emergency Conservation Committee, which was basically her and about 3 other people, bought the mountain, leased it with an option to buy, and created Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which was the first refuge in the world for birds of prey. And that was the... I often tell people they need to make a pilgrimage to Hawk Mountain to visit the Mother Church of Raptor Conservation. That's where it all began. And interestingly, the man who brought Hawk Mountain to the notoriety to her attention was a young man named Richard Poe, who was a camera buff in Philadelphia and took photographs of all these dead hawks that he and his friends would array on the ground to get this gruesome pictures. And Poe saw the example of what Rosalie Edge did at Hawk Mountain and realized that if you want to save a place, the thing to do is buy it. And so in the 1950s, that prompted Poe and a couple of other people to found the Nature Conservancy. So, you get these interesting connections and how the conservation movement has grown over the years. But a lot of it leads back to Rosalie.
It does, and one of the people that made a pilgrimage there was Rachel Carson, obviously.
Yes,
One of the iconic images we have of her is birding.
That's right, sitting up
Hawk
on North Lookout at Hawk Mountain.
Yeah, if it hasn't come across, and I think it has, that's one thing your books do beautifully is intertwine the human stories with the wildlife stories.
Well, thank you.
It really, I think those of us in the field know you can't separate the two, but oftentimes our works do, and I've always enjoyed the way you bring the two together.
Well, and the other thing about the kind of work that I do is that I do some field research, but most of what I write about is somebody else's work. Mm-hmm. I'm synthesizing the work of other people, and nobody does a better job of explaining that than the person who's passionate about it, who's out in the field. And so I cannot tell you how many times I'm always in the debt of the people who are actually in the field doing it, and I can't tell you how many times I've picked up the phone and said, "Hi, you don't know me, but you're working with Swainson's hawks in Argentina that are dying by the tens of thousands from monocrotophos poisoning, and I know you've got a field expedition planned for this winter, and I'd like to come down to Argentina with you for a month, and I'll just help out in any way I can so I can write about this." And there's this long,
what's the reaction? Yeah.
Well, there's this long pause on the other end of the call, and then I have never had somebody say no. Once or twice I've had people say, that could be difficult for X, Y, and Z logistical issues, but I've never had anybody say no. And that kind of generosity, I think, comes partly out of the kind of people that are drawn to wildlife and wildlife conservation, and partly out of just a passionate desire to share what is always an exciting story with other people.
Now, one of the species you have done research on is owls, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Tell us some of the more interesting things you've done with owls.
Well, I mean,
I don't want you to be too self-effacing about your own.
Well, I mean, the work I've been doing work for more than 15 years now with the northern saw-whet owl, which is about that big.
Cute little owl.
They are. You could not design a better species for engaging the public in wildlife conservation. They're the smallest owl in the East, one of the cutest animals in the world, and until recently, and that to a significant extent still, a very mysterious, little-known species. When we started working with them in the mid-'90s, they were the symbol of our State Wild Resource Conservation Fund because they were assumed to be very rare. It turns out they're one of the most common, maybe even the most common small forest raptor in North America. The work I do with saw-whet owls is through an organization called the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in central Pennsylvania. We have 3 banding stations spread out across central Pennsylvania. We have 18 federally licensed banders, all of whom are volunteers, working with another 85 crew members, all of whom are volunteers, and most of whom are as well trained as the banders are. They just don't have the piece of paper from the bird banding lab. The crew as a whole puts about 6,000 volunteer hours a year into this. We're running these stations from the 1st of October till the end of November, 7 nights a week. Almost everybody works a full-time job, so they drag themselves in dead tired in the morning. We've been doing radio telemetry. I mentioned we've done work with geolocators. We've done genetic work. It's been incredible to start to peel back the onion that is the northern saw-whet owl and understand a little bit more about their migration, a little bit more about their ecology. But the reason we've been able to be so successful at this is that we're part of a much larger network known as Project OwlNet, which is a collaborative effort of about 125 independent owl research sites across the U.S. and Canada. Some of them are on national wildlife refuges, some of them are Audubon centers, some of them are literally a bander working in their backyard, some of them are academic research institutions. But we all collaborate. We're working primarily off standardized protocols, and we're trading owls back and forth, so we connect those dots very, very quickly on where these birds are going and site fidelity and a whole host of other things. And because we're working with this incredibly small, cute, naive owl that has no fear of people, it's a perfect education opportunity. And a lot of the sites that collaborate in Project OwlNet, as with our site, bring people in. We get more than 1,000 visitors a year at our banding stations. And after you've weighed and measured and banded and poked and prodded and done all this stuff over the course of 5 or 10 minutes to this owl. You take them outside and you let their eyes adjust to the darkness, and then you pick some university student or fourth grader or member of the local civic club, and you put that owl up on their shoulder, and it sits there for 10 minutes
Awesome.
looking around. I mean, that's the definition of a teachable moment.
I like that.
That gets people hooked. So.
Well, speaking of education and charismatic species, the eaglets have been behaving very rudely. As you've been telling us about your books, they've been hopping around and not paying close attention.
They've both got their tails in. Yep, there we go. That's what I was expecting.
we did not plan that, but have you studied eagles, and do you have some?
Well, I've actually not worked with eagles, although I'm like everybody else, I'm fascinated by them, and I find myself shaking my head sometimes because, I started hawk watching at Hawk Mountain back in the late '60s, and in the late '60s, early '70s, the total fall migration count for bald eagles was often less than 24 birds.
Okay.
It was the pits of the DDT era. Bald eagle populations had collapsed all across the Northeast, across most of the continental United States. And I mean, it was such a big deal to see a bald eagle. And if you had told me that, in the year 2012, the state of Pennsylvania alone would have more than 250 nesting pairs of bald eagles, and that among the states in the Northeast, that would put it kind of at the bottom of of the number. I mean, we got, almost 1,000 pairs, I think, in the greater Chesapeake watershed. You get up into northern New York, New England, Maine. It's just incredible. They're everywhere. They've become a trash bird, and I find myself occasionally glancing up and going, "Oh, there's an eagle," and then stopping and going, wait a minute, stop, and attention must be paid. And bald eagles, peregrine falcons, ospreys, so many of these species that suffered so badly during the DDT era that have come roaring back now. And even species like Cooper's hawks and red-tailed hawks that within the last 15 years have become suburban or wholly urban species. I mean, there are 40 or 50 pairs of red-tailed hawks, I believe, nesting within the city limits of New York, actually within just Manhattan itself. It's no longer, this odd little thing. These birds have shown how incredibly adaptable they are if we give them a chance, if we don't pollute the environment to such an extent that we interfere with their reproduction. But it's still a dangerous world out there. It's still a toxic world for them. We're seeing issues with bald eagles in some areas, especially on the coast of California, where latent pesticides are still a reproductive issue for them. But boy, that's every time I see a bald eagle now, I kind of stop and give the greater conservation community a pat on the back because we've done good with this one.
Yeah, that's actually a profound point. I grew up in the same era, and I remember studying ecology and ornithology, and maybe saw 2 eagles throughout the academic year. We saw more golden eagles, but almost never a bald eagle. And we may be part of the last generation that can remember when bald eagles were not abundant.
That's right.
And really a rare sight. Same with turkeys. We never had turkeys growing up, and they've come back. And
oh my God!
All the raptors, hawks, falcons. So it was just a rare sighting.
But it's always a dynamic situation. And as bald eagle populations are going up, now we're seeing signs that golden eagle populations may be coming into more and more conflict with particularly industrial wind development. But we're not really quite sure what's going on with golden eagles. But that's an increasing area of concern for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Especially as we're changing the laws protecting bald and golden eagles, and trying to craft guidelines for wind development that are going to allow us to shift to renewable energy while also protecting migratory birds. And we still in many places don't have much baseline on what the impact of wind development is going to be on these birds. And then you have the eastern golden eagle population, which is very poorly known, that breeds in eastern Canadian subarctic and in the Gaspé Peninsula, and migrates down right through this part of the world here in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania and Virginia and West Virginia. And we know almost nothing about those birds. So trying to safeguard all these things in the absence of a lot of information makes it difficult.
Sounds like a good topic for a new Scott Weidensaul book. This intersection of human energy needs and avian needs and so on would be a good topic.
I'm going to write that one down.
After you finish the rest of your history series. Yeah. And we're at about the halfway mark, so this would be a good chance to segue to your most recent book. When did it come out exactly?
Just in February.
I knew it was recent, and I got my copy about a month ago. It's called The First Frontier, and it's about this part of the country, the Mid-Atlantic, basically, and it's a fascinating cultural history of two settlers to this part of North America at widely differing periods, the Native Americans and the later European settlers here. And I guess the first question is, how'd you pick the title?
Interesting topic. The title came to me. I worked on this for about 6 years. And the title came to me early on. There's a nice alliterative flow to it, and it kind of conveys the notion. And it wasn't until fairly late in the process that I discovered that there was another book on much the same topic that was published in the 1940s with that title, and I was absolutely mortified. And so I contacted my editor immediately, and I said, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to change the title." And she said, "You can't copyright book titles," which I guess I knew, but had never really thought about very much. And we went around and around and around on. I kept throwing new suggestions out, and she kept saying, "Nope, that's not as good as the title you originally had," and that's what we came out with. And so I'm still a little bit mortified. That 1940s era book actually was republished about 2 years ago. So there are actually two First Frontiers out there, and I've never had anybody copy one of my book titles, and I've never knowingly copied somebody else's. So that was the that's the odd backstory on that one. But it certainly does capture the flavor. I mean, it was the First Frontier in the sense that, and this was the place where Europe and Native America came together for the first time, starting about 1,000 years ago with the Vikings, and then building through waves of colonial exploration by the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and the Swedes and the English and the Portuguese, and the list just goes on. And the book itself covers about. Well, it's as you said, it starts with the original peopling of the Americas, and there's been so much new research in the last couple of years. I mean, when we were in college, we were taught, as dogma, that the first humans entered North America via the Bering Land Bridge, brave mammoth hunters coming across the Bering Land Bridge.
With those great illustrations.
Yeah, so about 13,000 years ago. The Clovis people with those big, beautifully fluted stone spear points. And, we know now that there have been humans in North America and, well, in the Americas as a whole for much longer than that. And there's this whole foment right now of research on who they were, how they got here. Was it multiple waves of immigration? Did they come in? I mean, certainly some of them came across the Bering Land Bridge, but did some of them travel by boat along with the so-called kelp highway that, this connected ecosystem of coastal kelp forest that stretches from Japan down to Southern California and on into South America, that would have provided a marine highway for anybody with any kind of even rudimentary watercraft. Did they come? I mean, there are some folks at the Smithsonian that argue at least some waves of immigration came from Europe across the edge of the global ice sheet at the height of the last ice age, hunting seals all the way across. And that's hugely controversial. I mean, this notion, a lot of Native Americans are deeply offended by the notion that, it's like, it's bad enough they colonized us once, now they're trying to colonize us again.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
But there are some similarities between the stone technology of Ice Age Europe and the pre-Clovis era. I don't have a dog in that fight. I just find it interesting as a writer and as somebody who's always been fascinated by archaeology that, that we're finding out the history of human occupation of the Americas is much older and much deeper than we thought. And of course, by the time you get to, the period that's the heart of my book, which is from about 1500 until the end of the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War in the 1760s, there was this incredible complex of native societies along the eastern seaboard. And I'm writing about from the Canadian Maritimes down to Florida, from these sophisticated urban chiefdoms in the south to agrarian societies to really true hunter-gatherer societies, especially in the north where the climate didn't lend itself to large-scale agriculture. The way that these native societies were continuing to evolve right up to the moment of European contact, and then of course evolved in radically new ways, as did the Europeans. I mean, you had this hybrid society growing up along the eastern seaboard as both of these sort of meta-societies tried and mostly failed to learn how to live with one another. And I'm hesitant to talk about native society in kind of a broad brush generalized way because it was so different, and also European society. I mean, the differences between agrarian English colonists coming to New England and the military and religious-based colonization of the Spanish in the South, and the religious and trade-based colonization of the French in the North were just, I mean, radically different. And even the idea of ethnicity, the way we think of it today, was really not there. I mean, an Oneida living in New York might feel less animosity toward his English or German neighbors than he would to another American Indian like the Catawba to the south, who were, traditional enemies. And, there was no unified European identity. I mean, the colonial period is rife with conflict with native society, but also among themselves. I mean, there were border wars fought, people died, there were, the notion of, all of these colonies, pushing in the same direction toward a,
Right.
it was just absolute fiction.
No, that comes up about nicely in that there's conflict before the Europeans arrived, there's conflict after they arrived, there's conflict within the various groups. And when you were describing the earlier period, we threw out different terms: Native Americans, American Indians, and you actually had one of the more interesting typescripts I've seen for describing native names and so on.
What I was trying to do with some of the...
So you've thought about
with some,
this.
and I'm trying to use the orthography that tribe today uses for, because a lot of the vocal sounds, a lot of the vowel sounds and consonant sounds aren't those that we use in English, and so there's a host of ways that you can try to convey that, and whether we're talking about Western Abenaki or Mohawk, and it really, I have to say, it drove my editor at Houghton Mifflin and the production manager at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt a little bit crazy, because they couldn't, on some of them, and there's one orthographic mark in Tuscarora that they just couldn't get right. And so for those who read the book who are native Tuscarora speakers, I apologize in advance. The best they could come up with was an upside down question mark, and that's not quite right. But I was, I can't, I'm not a native speaker, I can't pronounce these words, but I mean, I was trying to be as authentic as possible. I was trying to be just as a simple respect, basically.
Yeah, you show great sensitivity, and I thought that was very effective.
Well,
what's the best term for the early Americans? Did you prefer American Indian or Native American?
I used them fairly interchangeably, and with recognizing that every one of them is freighted with some issue and some problem, and just kind of put that out. There's a little thing in the beginning of the book it's a word on words, which just kind of lays it out on the table so that nobody realizes. So I'm hoping people realize that I've thought about this. That there's no one right answer. Even in native society, whether it's there are some people who prefer Native American, there are some people who prefer American Indian, there are some people who prefer First Nations. Part of that depends on where you are, if it's Canada, the United States, and you're not going to make everybody happy. And so I especially writing as an Anglo-American, tried to be as sensitive to that as possible and as upfront about why I was making the decisions I was.
I led you down a rabbit trail there. I apologize, but
No,
I
that's
lead you
fine.
down one more because, like I said, a lot of people will see this interview when they're visiting here at NCTC, and I'm curious, in this part of West Virginia, along the Potomac and so on, what would the native peoples have been who lived around here?
Well, see, that's the interesting part, because as I'm sure a lot of the folks who will be watching this recognize, there were massive disease epidemics that hit, particularly in the early 17th century, the so-called Great Dying that occurred from about 1615 to 1619 along the New England coast, just before the Pilgrims arrived, when huge swaths of the New England coast were depopulated. Well, those same epidemics propagated west and south out of New France, and huge areas of the Appalachians were depopulated before the first Europeans arrived. So we know relatively little about the pre-contact cultures and societies that lived, especially along the Appalachian Ridge and Valley system, the Appalachian Plateau country, the Ohio country, and points south. In fact, you can make an argument that, well, of course, at the time of first sustained contact in the late 1400s, early 1500s, there was no wilderness. The East was a heavily populated area, as many as 1 million people living along the eastern seaboard. But in the wake of those epidemics, and then also in the wake of some really brutal but little understood wars for the control of the fur trade that occurred in the late 1500s and early 1600s, what are known today as the Beaver Wars. Huge areas were depopulated, and so if there was wilderness in the East, it was probably in that period from about 1600 until the early 1700s, when areas like this would have been very lightly settled. And I can't speak specifically to the Upper Potomac. I'm not an expert on this area, and would be curious to learn more about this area specifically. But particularly when you get into the Upper Ohio River Valley, that was probably emptier during that period in the late 17th century than it had been for thousands of years before that. And the specialists will talk about the Monongahela people, these sort of amalgam of little known people that lived in those areas about which we know relatively little. They lived in many cases they lived in palisaded villages. There's been archaeological excavations, so it was a bad neighborhood. Obviously, if you're palisading your village, that means that there must have been warfare, but we don't know a whole lot beyond that.
Well, let's talk about the next wave of settlers, and that would be Europeans to come over here. Their story seems to be a little better chronicled, but it's more complex once again than we were taught in school.
And also, it starts much earlier than we were taught in school.
Does,
I think most Americans now, have heard about the Vikings coming to the New World in the late 900s AD, settling certainly in Newfoundland because we've got archaeological evidence there, but perhaps more widely than that, lousy neighbors. As soon as the Vikings showed up, they started killing people, and they got driven out by native hostility and also by changing climate. But perhaps as early as the 1300s, we're not really sure. Maybe even earlier than that, the Basques started coming over the northeastern coast, and that was, of course, they were drawn by cod and to a lesser extent the whale fisheries. And so you had these seasonal fishing camps, hundreds of Basque fishing boats coming over in the summer, fishing for cod, salting them on shore, having contact with the Betuk and the Micmac and other tribes along the northeast and in Newfoundland, trading with them, and keeping their mouths shut for hundreds of years. Nobody knew where all this cod was coming from that the Basques were bringing back. And then finally in the 1400s, 1500s, the fishermen in Bristol in England, in Brittany in France began to figure out this North Atlantic passage and come here as well. But there were hundreds and hundreds of years before what we think of as the first European explorers. Verrazano and Gosnold and Champlain. When Champlain was here in 1604, traveling down the coast of Maine, he was accompanied by two Micmac sachems sailing their own two-masted Basque sailing ship. In 1606, there was a French, a Parisian lawyer named Marc Lescarbot who came over and reported seeing another Basque-built sailing shallop being sailed by Micmacs, who had painted a huge red moose on the sail. Bartholomew Gosnold, who was one of the first English explorers along the New England coast, encountered another group of probably Micmacs sailing a shallop, dressed in serge trousers and buckled shoes. And when he asked them about Newfoundland, they pulled out a chalkboard and drew him a map of the coast and showed Newfoundland and showed him where the Basque fishing village of Placentia was up there. So they'd been in contact with Europeans for centuries. When people like John Smith came over here, of course we associate John Smith with Jamestown in 1607 in the Chesapeake, but he, about 7 years later, explored a lot of the New England coast. And the tribes that he was making contact with, who were so new and exotic for him, they'd been dealing with Europeans for centuries. So Europeans were far less exotic to them than they were to the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more fascinating aspects of your book. The Basque thing was totally new to me, and you do a superb job of pointing out that the American Indians had generations of tales about encounters with Europeans. They weren't
yes. Now, of course,
shocked.
as you go farther and farther south, that became less and less true. And so, the first contacts along the southeastern coast, or even the Mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay and the Virginia Tidewater, it was much more of a first contact. But even there, I mean, we think of Jamestown in 1607. The Spanish had tried to colonize that area a generation earlier. They'd sent missionaries in, and they were using so often the case, a cultural go-between, a young man who'd been kidnapped years earlier than that had been taken to Cuba. He'd been adopted by the viceroy. He spoke fluent Spanish. They took him back with the idea that he was going to be their entree to native society in Sonocomica, which was the big confederacy, the chieftain confederacy along the Virginia Tidewater. And he turned on them almost immediately, which, if you think about it, if you kidnap somebody and hold them against their will for years, and then you finally take him back home, he's probably not going to treat you with a great deal of kindness.
Right. And you had an example of a European who was kidnapped that behaved with rather very vengeful thoughts. Hannah Dustin.
Oh, yeah. Hannah's story is one of the most. It's the most difficult one, I think, to get my head around. To set the scene, it's the 1690s in Massachusetts. The first of these, we talk about the French and Indian War. Right. The first of 4 French and Indian Wars. The first of 4 of these big imperial wars that were being played out in North America. King William's War had broken out in the New England frontier, and a group of Kawasuk Abenaki had raided Haverhill, Massachusetts, and they took captive a woman named Hannah Dustin, who had just a week or so earlier given birth. They kidnapped her and one of her neighbors who was acting as a nurse, a woman named Mary Neff, and the baby. And it was winter time, the baby was young, it was probably crying. As they were leaving the farmyard, one of the warriors slung the baby by its legs and smashed its head against a tree and killed it. They march Hannah and Mary off into the wilderness up to the north. What to the women was wilderness, but of course to the Kawasuk was their homeland. And the war party began to break into smaller and smaller groups until eventually Hannah and Mary, along with a 14-year-old English boy, are in the holding of a small family band, 2 men, a couple of women, and 7 children. And they travel into what is now southern New Hampshire, along the Merrimack River, and they camp one night. And Hannah and Mary and the boy snatch up hatchets in the middle of the night and tomahawk almost all of them to death in their sleep. They spared one small child who ran away and a woman who escaped with a number of deep hatchet wounds to her head. Okay, you can understand that. You're kidnapped, you're taken far from home, there's an opportunity to turn the tables and you're captured. They smash holes in the bottoms of all the other canoes, they jump in the canoe and they escape. And then they turn around at Hannah's urging. They go back to the site of this attack. And she very methodically and coldly strips the scalps from all of the women and children and men, stuffs them into her apron along with some other booty that she's taken, and then they finally make their escape. And she goes back to Boston, where she's paid a bounty for all of these scalps. Hannah Duston was the first woman in North America to have a statue raised in her honor. There's actually two of them. One in Haverhill, where she's got the tomahawk in her hand, and one at a state park in New Hampshire at the site of this attack, where she's holding a scalping knife in her hand. Now, from the Abenaki perspective, this was not, you know, a vengeful mother taking righteous revenge and you know, the heroic, plucky pioneer woman. I mean, this was a woman who was just this side of demonic, who killed a bunch of innocent women and children. And even today, Hannah Duston remains a real object of controversy in her hometown, among the residents of Massachusetts, and among the Abenaki, who are the descendants of those who kidnapped her and also eventually were killed by her. So I find myself back and forth. I mean, I can certainly understand why you would do what you did up to a point, but the going back and stripping the scalps off the head of small children just seems incredibly gruesome. And Henry David Thoreau wrestled with that. Hawthorne wrestled with that. A lot of writers since then have wrestled with exactly what Hannah Duston represents about that early colonial period.
And yet it's very evocative in your own book. The book is keyed around characters whose lives, by modern standards, seem incredibly difficult and savage. Savagery is in your title, and it really is. I mean, they're on the precipice of death, either through the bare subsistence methods,
right,
living, or being surrounded by both allies and enemies at almost every, of all types, Europeans against Europeans, and
again,
vice versa.
And again, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that word savagery,
yeah,
I mean, that's a hot button word, sure, especially in native society, because after 5 centuries of being called savages, obviously most American Indians have a certain sensitivity about that. This is meant in an equal opportunity way. It was a savage lifestyle. There was savagery committed on both sides, against both sides, within both sides. It was a brutal time. The notion of the value of human life that we hold today, sometimes only honor in the breach, was far less so then, and it was difficult in dealing with other people, and it was a difficult landscape at times. I mean, nature would make a serious attempt to try to kill you during that period, and I tell the story in the book of, and here again, many of the stories that I'm able to tell in detail are stories of Europeans, of settlers, of colonists, because it was a literate culture, and many of these stories were written down as opposed to being passed down in the oral tradition. For every colonial action, echo, letter, there is a native echo that was lost to us through history. But I tell the story about a young boy named John Giles, who was kidnapped from his home in Maine in 1689 at the age of 10, also part of this King William's War. And unlike many captives who were adopted, became full members of the native society, Giles was kept as a slave. And he survived, fairly brutal treatment at the hands of the Malecite, but the times when his life was really in jeopardy was just the landscape. The band that owned him as a slave, that lived along the St. John River in New Brunswick, in wintertime, the Malecite would spread out across tens of thousands of square miles of northern Maine, New Brunswick, Quebec, going from winter camp to winter camp. And he was sent with another Malecite boy to fetch frozen moose meat from a kill site where the hunters had cached the kill, and they got caught in a blizzard. And because he was a slave, his clothing was not of particularly good quality. The young Malecite boy was able to survive and snowshoe back. Giles suffered really profound frostbite, really should not have survived, almost froze to death any number of times. Finally made it back to the village. He said all of the skin on both feet sloughed off whole like a sock. And because he was a slave, he was responsible for his own care. And so they told him to collect balsam fir sap, fir gum, and soften it on the fire and spread it as a salve on his leg. And so he's pushing himself around on his butt on the snow with 2 sticks because he couldn't walk on his feet. But within a matter of a couple of weeks, the band moved, and it was either walk or die. And so with little round snowshoes on his feet, in excruciating pain, he hobbled along after them. And he survived. He managed to make it back 10 years later to his family, became an interpreter and a militia captain along the coast. And I think it's the measure of the man that many years later, when he was commanding a fort along the St. George River, his old Maliseet owner showed up. And as he said in his memoirs, simply, I made him very welcome. There was just obviously no bitterness there. Giles's memoirs are easy to read, and they're one of the most extraordinary accounts of that early frontier period. Somebody once described them as a combination of anthropological report, natural history, and horror story. Which
could be a description of your book to a certain extent. You take us into a totally different culture in a real sense that I think is as foreign to us today as ancient Rome and so on. I think actually the character and probably the psychological stress is so much different. Not that we don't have these today, but they were different.
Very, very different. And the other reason, the main reason I wrote this book is because when we say the word frontier, what immediately comes to mind is Conestoga wagons going across the Platte River, and the fight at the Little Bighorn, and Lewis and Clark ascending the Missouri River. And this was the frontier. Everywhere you set your foot in the east, from Manhattan to Maine to the low country of the Carolinas, was frontier. And that history is still here. You just have to scratch a little bit deeper to find it.
So did Frederick Jackson Turner have it right with his frontier thesis? Is this the cauldron for the American character?
We certainly have made it the mythic cauldron for the American character. But here again, I mean, there's frontier and there's frontier. I mean, there were so many different colonial approaches. There were so many different native societies that the flavor of the frontier in different areas was radically different. But all of that together kind of bubbles around in our collective consciousness and creates that mythic American frontier that we still draw so much of our national identity from.
Right. We're just about out of time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this last question, because so much of the book is built around biography. These are real people's stories that illustrate your broader themes, and your state's founder, William Penn, pops up prominently, and just in a much more ambivalent light, perhaps, than the traditional William Penn painting of him trading fairly with the Native Americans and so on. Give us a nutshell.
I think to a certain extent, Penn gets a little bit more credit than he deserves. Although, in comparison to almost everybody else, Penn deserves all the credit that he gets for dealing fairly. He dealt as fairly with the Lenape as the Delaware Indians as he was able to, as a man an Englishman of some means of 17th century society. As far as he was buying the land from them, although there was never any question in his mind that they would just sell him all the land he wanted. And of course, from his perspective, he already owned it because he'd been given this royal charter by King Charles. And so, he felt that he was doing the right thing, and he paid in cloth and fish hooks and copper kettles and things that seem almost worthless to us today, but which represented radically different technologies and incredibly desirable objects on the part of the native society. Of course, the difficulty in those early days is that what Penn and other early European colonists thought they were buying, that they were making a one-time payment for all rights, from the native perspective, these were gifts being given for the use of this land, and these gifts would be, renewed from time to time. And so, you talk about our phrase Indian giver today. This notion that, well, I already paid for the land once, and now they want me to pay for it again. That's because he had two totally different understandings. Now, with time, the native society understood what was meant by land sales. And if you look at the history of land purchases along, for example, the Maine coast, most of them were pretty much on the up and up on both sides. There was not the kind of chicanery that we saw later with Penn's Sons, where there was this out-and-out land fraud like the walking purchase, where they were trying to steal as much land as possible through fraud and forgery and just plain chicanery.
We're out of time, so if inquisitive viewers want to know how this communication turned out, they should read the whole story in the book. It's called The First Frontier. It is the First Frontier written by Scott Weidensaul, not the other right. Similarly named book. It's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. Scott, thank you so much for coming back to NCTC, sharing your new book, and revisiting some of your earlier ornithological books. We really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.